Thanks, Trixie. It's really great to have you all here with us this evening. We've all been looking forward to this night for a while. One of the COVID silver linings is being forced to reconsider our programming and really being able to imagine what might be possible. I've been following the work of Jeff Selingo for years as he's written and presented on topics in higher education and notably admissions for some time. But this year, after his current book, Who Gets In and Why, came out, it's felt like Jeff is everywhere, and for good reason. He's able to clearly articulate the important information around the college admissions process with a level head, a voice of reason, realism, and approachability. A bit more about Jeff. He's written about higher ed for more than 2 decades and is a New York Times bestselling author of 3 different books. His latest book, Who Gets In and Why, A Year Inside College Admissions, was published this past September 2020 and was named among the 100 notable books of the year by the New York Times. A regular contributor to The Atlantic, Jeff is a special advisor for innovation and professor of practice at Arizona State University. He also co-hosts the podcast Future You, which is definitely worth checking out if you're a podcast person like me and maybe Jeff, I assume. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his family. We're so incredibly lucky to have Jeff here with us this evening. The program will be about an hour, a couple logistics. It's going to be structured into 3 parts. Jeff will start by sharing some insights and comments with us. I'll ask Jeff some common questions we've prepared prior to this evening, and then we'll take your questions from the chat. I'm also joined this evening not only by Trixie and Jeff, but by my college office colleague, Julie Hertz, who will be culling your questions throughout the session. So go ahead and write them in as you have them, and we'll do our best to address them. And we're going to apologize in advance that in 1 hour to accomplish all this, we're not going to get to everyone's questions, but this is sort of a piece of an overall conversation, and we hope it will be ongoing. So you're here to see Jeff. I'm here to hear Jeff. Thanks for being here. And without any further ado, I will now turn the mic over to our special guest this evening, Jeff Selingo. Welcome to Shady Side Academy.
Well, Lauren, thank you. And that's a virtual welcome. I wish I could be there in person to see all of you tonight, and hopefully we will meet one day in the near future. But I appreciate the invite tonight. And my goal tonight is to tell you a little bit about the book, but also to give you an inside look at the admissions system and the ecosystem. And I'm often asked why I wrote this book. And 5 years ago, I reread a book that I read in previous times called Fast Food Nation. And maybe some of you read that book, maybe even the vegetarians out there read that book. And Fast Food Nation really explained the ecosystem of an industry. Right, I didn't really know at all, right? And it did so by introducing me to real people, a potato farmer in Idaho, an owner of a Little Caesars franchise, and by taking me inside the process, right, a meatpacking plant, and putting the industry in historical context, right, by telling readers the founding story of Carl's Jr., for example. And in reading that book, I realized the story of admissions was ripe to be told in the same way. And what I did in this book was really explain to you the ecosystem of admissions through 3 buckets of characters. One, the institutions themselves. So I was embedded in the admissions process at 3 institutions, 3 selective institutions, Davidson College in North Carolina, Emory University in Atlanta, and the University of Washington in Seattle. Now, you're probably saying, well, I don't want to apply to any of those schools. What can I learn from this? Basically, what this shows is the ecosystem. It shows the selection system that colleges and universities all over the country use, and particularly those that are selective colleges. We're going to use that word a lot tonight. Selective colleges, top-ranked colleges, whatever you want to say. But selective colleges, there are about 200 or so in this country that accept fewer than 50% of students, and they are called selective colleges. Now, you might say, but there's thousands of colleges out there. And I think that's the point one of the points I want to make tonight is that we tend to get really angst-ridden about the college selection process. And I think we have to remember there are thousands of colleges and universities across the country, 4,000 plus colleges and universities. And even if you think, well, I just want to know about the 4-year colleges and I want to know about colleges maybe I've actually heard of, we're still talking about a universe of about 1,200. And among those colleges, they accept most of the students who apply. So I think it's really important to put this in perspective tonight, that my hope in explaining this system, this ecosystem of admissions, is that we also give ourselves a chance to really think more broadly about the ecosystem of higher education out there, that it's more than just 20 schools or 30 schools, that we're actually talking about not only hundreds that are considered selective, but more than 1,000 colleges out there that I think are potentially a good fit for your students and for your children. So as I said, there were 3 buckets of characters in the book, and if you've read it, you know that I was embedded in these 3 institutions. I also followed a group of seniors through the process. In the year that I was embedded in the process, I followed a group of about 30 plus students, and I introduced you to 3 and their families and their counselors in the book. And the third group is a very important group, and it is the people who are on the periphery of higher education and on admissions, but they contribute to what is now a $9 billion, with a B, billion-dollar industry. And that includes the marketing agencies that send you all that mail, whether it's snail mail or email. It's the testing agencies. Even in this year, it is the financial aid consultants that help colleges decide, if we give the student $500 more, will they enroll? It is all of these groups that are on the outside looking in, but actually have a huge impact, not only in where you apply, where you get in, and how much money you get. And why is that important? It's important because I think we tend to get emotional about the college search, right? If you went to college, you think about your own college, maybe you really love the place. It's interesting to me when I go to New Jersey, on Jersey Shore every summer on vacation, and you probably see this no matter where you go, people are wearing shirts in their 80s and 90s of colleges. And I'm always curious, is it where your money goes as a grandparent, or is it where you went to school? And they will tell me this great story about how they went to the school and why they love it. I mean, we have this emotional attachment to higher education, but I hope in the conversation that we're going to have tonight that this is a purchase decision. You are making a purchasing decision, just like if you were to buy a house, if you were to buy a car. And in this game and in this purchasing decision, colleges really hold a lot of the cards. And so I think we need to become better consumers. Yes, we can have an emotional attachment to the college that we want to go to or the college that we went to. But I think it's really important to learn as much as you can learn about this process so that you ask better questions, you're better informed, and at the end of the day, you won't have regrets, like maybe that house you might have bought one time or that car you bought one time, and you realize, I just wish I knew more or negotiated a better deal. And that is really, in many ways, I think, as you're approaching the college search process, to be thinking about. Now, it's interesting, when I first started researching this book, I came across a box of US News and World Report rankings going all the way back to the 1980s. So I actually got my start writing about higher education for US News and World Report. I was a summer intern in the summer of 1994 between my junior and senior year of college. And I worked on the college rankings, and I became good friends with an editor there. And when he passed away about a decade ago, his widow gave me this box of US News and World Report rankings. And I looked through the 1990 edition of the rankings, which is probably the rankings I would have looked at as a student in high school. And looking through that, there was a list of acceptance rates for colleges. And when you look at those today, they almost seem like typos. Washington University in St. Louis accepted 62%. 62% of students back then. I was talking to the admissions dean today. They were closer to 10% and under 10% this year. So what's happened over the last 30 years in higher education? And what's interesting about that is, for those parents out there who went to college themselves, you probably went to college in the 1980s and maybe early 1990s, and you remember how the process was so much different. And there's a couple of things that have changed that have made this a very different process for your kids. For one, the concept of distance has really changed. So, right, places that once felt far away now seem like they're one town over, thanks to the internet and discount airlines. So what's happening now is that, and we're really seeing that this year, is that high achieving students rather than thinking about their local institution or regional institution, are now starting to jump into applicant pools at schools with national and international brands. And this is really kind of resorting these brands over the last 20 or 30 years. And many of them have been able to push that even further with marketing campaigns or trying to move up in the rankings. And so now you have this group of schools that are attracting the top students from all over the country, and it's just attracting so many more of them. And this is partly why today's admissions process seems so much more intensely competitive and anxiety ridden to the parents who went to college in the 1980s. It's not that there are so many more top students applying to college, it's that the top ones are applying to this small set of colleges, and they're applying to way more than just one or two of them that we probably apply to. And that's what we're seeing in this huge growth in even applications this year. And why is that? The second trend is because of technology, right? When I applied to college back in 1990, I had to type out my application and put it in the mail, and now we can just press a button and send as many applications as we want. So back in the 1980s, most students applied to just one or two colleges. That was the norm. Now today, fewer than 15% of students only apply to one or two colleges. So most students now are applying to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 institutions. Finally, the final reason that there's so much more anxiety about getting into the top college, I think, is that there's worry in general about our kids. And I know this as a parent of two girls who are thankfully only in elementary school right now, but we think stability is increasingly scarce. And so when it comes to the college search, I think many of us want to pull out as many stops as we can afford, because we tend to think that a degree from a brand name institution is the best insurance policy we can buy for our children's future. And one of the things that I hope we get to answer tonight is that there are many good colleges out there. They may not have the brand name that some people want to put on the back of their car with that bumper sticker, but we know from the outcomes data that we're now tracking better than ever before that those students get good jobs too and have good lives. And in many ways, and one of the things I found not only in reporting this book, but in my last book, There Is Life After College, is that we found that it's often how you go to college, the people you meet, the mentors you find, the faculty you have, the majors, the internships you have, those experiences often count more to success after college than the name on your degree. And so I think that's really important to remember this year in particular, as we're seeing these headlines about small numbers of students being accepted. So let me get to those headlines for a second, and then we'll move into the Q&A, because one of the questions I'm getting is how much is this year an anomaly, and how much are the impact of this year going to carry forward? So as you know, the virus last year canceled the SAT and ACT tests at hundreds and thousands of centers around the world. And as a result, 600 colleges went test optional just last year. Now, test optional was already a thing before the pandemic, but it was mostly small liberal arts colleges and mostly less selective institutions were test optional. But the entire Ivy League and most selective institutions went test optional last year. And what did that do? That encouraged students to say, I don't need a test score to apply to Harvard, so why not apply to Harvard? And that's what we saw. Harvard's application rate went up 42%. Colgate doubled the number of applications. 160,000 people applied just to UCLA, right? A growth of 18%. The numbers were mind-boggling in many ways. Now, my feeling is that for next year, some of those numbers are going to come back to their historical averages, even though many of these colleges are still test optional for another year. Because I think what we're starting to see this week, and we'll probably talk a little bit about this tonight about testing, is that first of all, students are going to be able to get to many of these campuses next year, over the next year. And so what we saw is that many students not only applied to these selective colleges because they said, why not, but they also couldn't get to campuses and they applied to more schools as a result this year. We're not going to see that as much next year, right? We're going to see students able to get to schools, cross them off their list, and thus not apply. So we're going to start to see some depression in the applications, I believe, because of that. And secondly, more students are going to be able to take a test in the coming year, given where we think the the pandemic is going. And so more students are going to apply to these highly selective schools, even though they'll still be test optional with test scores. Now, the number one question I get when I talk to parents these days is, should I take the test? Should I submit a test score? We're starting to get some data from colleges and universities over the last couple of weeks about this admissions cycle. And I will be honest with you, we're not getting much data at all. In fact, I talked to a number of deans over the last couple of days, and I said, well, why are you not releasing numbers, right? Why are you not telling us what percentage of applicants apply test optional, about the acceptance rate with a test score, without a test score? And I think many of them are really nervous because there are numbers within the numbers, and they don't want the context is really important to them. So what I've been finding in general is that this year at, again, the most selective schools, in general, about half the applicant pool came with test scores, about half didn't. Now, again, there is overlap between these applicant pools, but people are applying to different schools. So it's really hard to make blanket statements on this. But in general, what I'm hearing is half applied with scores, half didn't apply with scores. We are seeing acceptance rates higher for those with test scores than those without. And it's largely because I'm being told by these admissions deans that the application, and we'll talk a little bit about this tonight, you're also looking at other things beyond test scores, right? You're also looking at high school curriculum and the grades earned in high school and extracurricular activities and things like that. And they said on average that the students who came with test scores had higher average scores overall because they score their high school curriculum and grades. In other words, they came with a better curriculum and better grades. And they also tended to have a test score. So the thing that I think to remember, and again, hopefully we'll get more into this in the Q&A throughout the night tonight, is that everything that comes in an application, everything that you're sending in with an application to a college is a signal of your potential or what you have done. Your grades, the courses you decided to take, your recommendations, your essay, think of them as signals, or you're making a case to the admissions officer on the other side of the desk. The test is just one of many signals. It's not the only signal. Many times I did not see a test that put somebody in a class or necessarily took them out of a class, right? They were looking at the entire student's application. But I think the key is that if you think I can take a test safely and I'm going to get a good score on it, or you go and take the test and you get a good score on it, there's no reason not to submit that score. This is something you should definitely talk to your college counselors about. But for the most part, it's yet another signal. And at the end of the day, you want to be providing as many positive signals in your application as possible. You want to make that case to the admissions office that you're worth accepting. And so again, we'll talk hopefully more tonight about the SAT and the ACT and test optional. And we'll be going a little bit more into how applications are reviewed and everything else. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on the book and a little bit of background about how things are changing this year. And I look forward to the conversation tonight.
Thanks. Giving us a lot to chew on for sure. So maybe I'll just start with this particular moment in time. You talked about being an intern in US News, like you've been on this beat for a while, and you talked a little bit about how the book came to be, but what made you want to write this book at this time? And obviously you started pre-pandemic.
Yep.
Why this book now?
Because Lauren, I was getting a lot of whenever I would write a story for the Atlantic or the Washington Post or somebody else, I would get a lot of notes from parents and counselors saying, what's changed, right? They really wanted to know, why is it so much more difficult to get into a college today? And one of the things I knew as somebody who's been covering this for more than 20 years is that it actually isn't, right? The average acceptance rate at American college or university is about 60%. 60%, right? So most colleges accept most students. And every year, UCLA takes a survey of freshmen on college campuses across the country, not just at UCLA. They do a national survey, a national freshman survey. And according to that survey, almost 75% of freshmen say they're at their first choice college. So one of the things I think we should all do tonight is take a collective breath and say, most students apply to colleges that accept most students, most applicants, and most applicants end up at their first choice college. I think that's really important to remember. So what we're really talking about are a small selection of colleges and universities that are our most selective, that have these brand names that people want to go to. And I get that, right? We want to be associated with these brand names. So I wanted to know, well, what is happening inside those offices, right? We know 20 years ago, Jack Steinberg, who's a reporter at the New York Times, did a book called The Gatekeepers, a great book around Wesleyan University, and looked at the admissions process then. But that's when we used to mail in applications. They used to mail acceptances. About a third of students applied to Wesleyan that year as apply now, right? It was a much different process. And so I wanted to get inside this process. I also wanted to show, how does it differ at a small little liberal arts college like Davidson compared to a big private university in an urban area like Emory, and a big public university, since 80% of students, by the way, go to a public university? How is the process at a University of Washington look compared to those other two? And one of the things I think you can take from the book is that, again, the process is different at every school, but if you're applying to a liberal arts college, very similar to what Davidson's doing. If you're applying to the University of Washington, very similar to, for example, to what Pitt is doing. So, Carnegie Mellon, very similar to what Emory is doing. So I think that there's things you can learn from this book. But what I hope it does at the end of the day is it lowers our temperature a little bit. And it makes us, as I said in the beginning, better consumers. Because by understanding the ecosystem, we understand where perhaps our best fit is. But we also understand what are the questions we should be asking, and how can we understand this process so that we go into it with eyes wide open.
So one of the ways that you explain the ecosystem in the book is the concept of like buyers and sellers. And I'm not going to spend all this time on having you dissect the book. We've done a social media post every day for the past 14 with some of the gems, but this is one of the most key concepts that we've taken away from the book. And I think it's one of the most important and easy ways for families to wrap their heads around this ecosystem in a new way. Can you explain a little bit more about the buyers and sellers concept and how that plays into the list?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important concept, because the one, if I leave you with any takeaway tonight, it is to have a balanced list, right? I see this every year in talking to students, that they're shooting for the stars, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's all you're shooting for, there's a very good chance you might not get accepted to any of those schools. Or if you get accepted, you might not get the money you need. And let me explain that. So what happened in the year that I was following these students, I would see this. I would be in these schools in April. These students had already found out their admissions decisions, and they also got their financial aid packages, and they came into their counselors and they said, first of all, we didn't get into all these schools that we applied to. We only got into 1 or 2, and we applied to 10. And by the way, even those 2 I got into, I didn't get any aid or much aid at all. And what's happening is that they apply to what I call in the book the sellers. And the sellers have something to sell, a brand name. They have way many more applicants than they have seats. And while they're very generous with financial aid, and we're really talking about essentially the top 50 schools here, both liberal arts and national universities, while they have a lot of money to give out in financial aid, almost all of that money goes to need-based aid, 95% of it. Now, they're also very generous with need-based aid. But if you're one of those parents who might just make just enough to not qualify for need-based aid, but you don't make enough to pay for 4 years of full price college, you get caught in the middle there, and you don't really get much need-based aid, if any, and you can't really or don't want to afford the full 4-year price. Meanwhile, there's a lot more colleges, 1,000 plus colleges on the other side that are buyers. And what I think is important about the buyers is that it has nothing to do with the quality of education. And I'll give you an example in a minute. Nothing to do with the quality of education, but it's more about that they may just not have the brand recognition of some of these other schools. And so every year they have to give out more in merit aid, discounts, coupons, whatever you want to call them, in order to pull those students in. And so they might, even if you can afford college, they might give you a $20,000 discount just to get you to come. So let me just give you examples of some buyers and sellers from the book. One is Emory, where I was embedded. Emory is a seller. 90+% of its financial aid goes to need-based financial aid. Meanwhile, a school that might also be on somebody's list who's looking at Emory is Tulane. Tulane is a buyer. About 50% of its financial aid goes to merit-based aid. And so you have a much better chance of getting a merit-based scholarship at a Tulane than you do at an Emory. An example not far from your own home there. You have Carnegie Mellon, which is a seller. Most of its aid goes to need-based aid. And then you have a Case Western, which is a buyer, right? Where again, a significant portion of its aid, it goes to merit-based aid. And so one thing that I think is important as we're talking about balancing a list, it's not only about the academic and social fit, but it's also about this financial fit. And I encourage people, if you think that financial aid is important to you, to make sure you have some buyers and sellers on that list. Because if you only have sellers on that list, not only might you not get in to a lot of these places, but you then may not get the money you need in order to afford it.
Thanks. So what surprised you after 2 decades of reporting on admissions? What surprised you? And this will be sort of a segue into like, give us all your best advice, right? You know this stuff maybe better than anyone. Yep. We have a lot of parents with us, but we also have some students. And so if you can kind of share with us what came as a surprise to you or what was new,
yep.
And then how does that sort of translate into advice for families starting this, advice for parents partnering with their kids, advice for kids trying to figure this all out. Give us your wisdom, Jeff.
So a couple of things surprised me. I spend an enormous amount of time in the first chapter talking about marketing because I think it's important, because who you get mail from really shapes this process for a lot of students. And so on average, a student's name is sold 17, 18 times to colleges. When you fill out that form, it's a little different this year because of the SAT and ACT, but when you fill out that form to even take the PSAT, your name is being sold perhaps 70 times. And it's really interesting that really some of these colleges, what they're really trying to do is just boost the number of applications they get so they could just deny even more students because it will make them look more selective. So that's one thing that I think is important. Again, all that mail doesn't mean they necessarily want you. They might want your application. Second, is that this is all about the college's priorities, right? It's not about you, the applicant. And again, not to make you more anxious about this, but again, to put you in this frame of mind that colleges have priorities. They might need more kids from South Dakota. They might need more men. They might need more humanities majors. They might need, very narrow. They might need a third baseman for the baseball team. Whatever those priorities are fulfilled by the admissions office. So just because a college has a 25% acceptance rate doesn't mean you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting in. You might have a 90% chance of getting in if you come to the table with what they need, or a 0% chance if you're like everybody else. And that's the other thing. I think we tend to think this is the depth and breadth of these pools really surprised me. There was a moment I talk about in the book at Emory where I'm sitting there one afternoon in January and we're looking through regular decision applications. And I'm looking at all the stats on the student, 1490 on the SAT, 6 APs, all these grades. And I'm thinking to myself, didn't we just see this applicant like 5 applications ago? And then I realized, no, there's and 5 others just like this person coming up, right? The breadth and depth of these pools are enormous. And again, we might think we're really good at our high school, but then think about you being replicated at 25,000 high schools across the country. Again, I'm not saying this to discourage you from applying to these great schools out there. I'm doing it to widen your lens to say, we have to have this balanced list, because the students who are going to be happiest at the end are those that have this balanced list and love it, by the way, that they just didn't put a school on there because somebody told them to, but they really like all of these schools. And then the final piece, Lauren, is this idea of shaping, right? So I always thought you send in your application, they look at it, and you're either in or you're out. And that's true for a decent portion of the applicant pool. But what they do at the very end, right before they send out those acceptances and denials, is they look at the whole class and they say, what do we not have enough of? And what do we need more of in terms of, again, going back to their priorities? This is where they're looking at gender balance and racial and ethnic balance. This is where they're looking if they care about legacy status. This is where they're saying, did we really look at that student who had legacy status? Now, what they're looking at, not, by the way, is not the entire pool again. They're looking for these students who are really close to the line. They mark them throughout, right? So these people who just got in or maybe barely didn't get in, and they're looking, could they move some of these students around to balance this class out? And that's a process that I describe in the introduction of the book and later on in the book that I never realized. By the other reason that comes into play is sometimes around finances. Some of these schools that are need aware don't want to necessarily necessarily accept students they can't afford with financial aid, and so they actually might put them at that point in the denial bit. So those were the three things that really struck me. Now, in terms of advice, let me just put out one piece of advice, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, and that is, again, talking about the strength of the applicant pool. If we think of everybody starting this race on the same line, so we have 30,000 applications and they're all lined up at the starting point, what gets you more than halfway to the finish line are two things: high school curriculum and high school grades, especially at these selective colleges. They know from their own research at their own university, and they know from the research, the national research, that those two things, the rigor of the curriculum and the grades you got into those. And when I say grades, were they steady? Were they on an upward trend? They don't want grades that are all over the place, and they don't want a downward trend. They will excuse a low grade here or there, but they really want either consistency or consistently going up, because they know those two things really lead to success in college, right? Will you be retained, and will you stay in college, and will you graduate? Will you be able to do the work? Those two things matter the most. And so that's something, by the way, in your control to be thinking about that. There's all these other things out of your control, like the institutional priorities I talked about tonight, but that is in your control. And that's where I think students should focus the most.
The timing is perfect. Our course registration is this week, I think, due into the course registration system Friday. So this is on everybody's mind. So it's definitely a good reminder to be thinking about that. What about misconceptions? Like what misconceptions do you see families holding on to about the college process?
Well, it really is a holistic process. And I know that really frustrates most parents and students. Like, tell me the things that get me in, right? And it's not that easy. It's not that list, right? It is, as I describe in the book, they have this precise numbering system. They're reading these applications and they're judging them on a 1 to 5 scale around, curriculum and intellectual curiosity and extracurricular activities, whatever it might be. And then they say, okay, that person's a 3 on that, and that person's a 4 on that. And you think, wow, this is really precise. And it's no more precise than when you're watching the Olympics and you're watching figure skating or diving, and they're putting up those numbers, right? It sounds like a precise system, but it really isn't. And there isn't that one thing that gets you over the line, right? It's not 50 more points on the SAT. It's not one more AP course. They're really looking at the full context, or they're really looking at the full application of the student. I just said that word context because that is critically important, because what they're doing when they open up the application, and again, the first thing they're looking at is high school transcript, that curriculum and grades. And they're looking at what was available to that student. So they know most of these high schools, if they've sent a lot of students to that school, these admissions officers read applications in regions they represent, and they know these high schools well. Sometimes they even know the counselors well, but they also get something that is called the high school profile that comes along with the application. So they know what is available at that school, how many AP courses you have, the grading policies, where your students go to college, all these things about the high school. So they look at that, at the high school transcript of that student, and they say, okay, what was available to the student and what did they take? And they want to, it's not that they're saying you have to take every hard class that the school offers, but if you want to major in math at one of these top colleges, and you didn't take, the top calculus class, the AP calculus class, and instead you maybe took statistics or you took pre-calc or something like that, that's going to be a flag. They're going to look for stuff like that. And you say, well, what if I got an A in pre-calc and I would have gotten a B in AP Calc? Well, they would actually prefer an A in the AP Calc. That's what they'll say, but they're going to look for the rigor of that course in many ways, a little bit more than the grade. They do weigh them pretty closely, but they are really looking for that rigorous coursework. And so that to me is the context of it, is what they're looking for. So what was available to me and how did I do? Then they're looking at, as I said, in the shaping process, they're looking at the context of the whole class. Now, you may agree or disagree with this, but they don't want all kids from Pittsburgh, right? They don't want all kids from Pennsylvania, especially these national and international institutions. They don't want all students who are going to major in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, right? They want some humanities majors. A big thing right now is gender, right? Many of these schools are closing in on 60-40 women to men, right? They just don't want, they're coeducational, and they don't want a class that's 80% women and 20% men, right? So they're always constantly looking at the context of the class as well. And again, this is why some of these things are out of your control.
Maybe the final one that I'll throw to you right now. You talked about the different ways that kids go through the process. So I really loved how you had the buyers and sellers for colleges, but you gave us some other tools around the ecosystem, the sort of the ecosystems around that college ecosystem. And you talked about different ways students go through the process. What's your best advice for parents on how to partner with their kids through the process?
I know this is, I have two children. They're only in 5th and 3rd grade, so I don't have to, I could dispense with the advice. I could give the advice tonight. I don't necessarily have to follow it tonight. First of all, this is your kid's search, right? This is not your college search. Now, you're obviously guiding, and you have to put guide rails up there, especially around maybe money and things like that. And so definitely talk about that early on. But this is their search. You're not trying to reimagine your own search and how you would have done it, or where you wanted to go and didn't get to go 20 or 30 years ago, or you loved your place and you want them to go there, right? This is about them. And so that's number one to remember, helping them and guiding them along. And some, as I talk in the book, some are drivers and they'll push ahead and they'll move very fast and they'll be really engaged, or they'll be very disengaged. I had a friend here in DC whose son just went through this, and he just told me how disengaged he was. But things turned out, right? That he did what he was supposed to do when he was supposed to do it, and ended up discovering what he loved out of the process. And his parents there was many times they wanted to push him, but they didn't. So I think that's one thing to remember. And also remember it as a family, right? You go to high school once in your life, and you don't want this to overwhelm high school. You want to be able to remember high school as high school and not as a year or two of a college admissions process. So sure, go on the college tours, do those summer trips to visit colleges and things like that. But there's a piece of advice that Rick Clark, who's the director of admissions, who, by the way, has a great blog and podcast on admissions, and highly recommend it. He also co-wrote a book on keeping the family together during admissions, which I always highly recommend. And there's a piece of advice that he gave me a couple of years ago, and it's this: really set out some time constraints around the college search. Maybe talk about it once a week, around maybe after family dinner. If you have family dinner on Sundays, maybe say an hour after family dinner, we're going to talk about college. Now, obviously, there will be moments in the process, like right now, if you're a senior, where you're trying to decide where to go and there's all this information coming in, you have to make a lot of decisions. You're going to have to talk about it more than once a week, and probably every night and several hours maybe. But those should only be certain moments through the process. Really putting this in perspective, spending that time, that's our time to talk about college, so that the rest of the week you could enjoy high school, focus on the things that are important to colleges, like the courses and the grades and things like that. But don't let this overwhelm you, because it will be angst ridden then, and you're not going to enjoy it.
Thanks. We agree. We talk to students and families about that a lot. All right. So at this point, I think we'll start taking some questions from our audience here. I see some in the chat, and Julie's been working hard behind the scenes to pick them out and find the patterns and call them for us. So what do you got, Julie?
All right. Well, I think what we have are some families who have been doing their homework, who have read the book, who have been listening, and who have been paying attention, and they've got some great questions. So Jeff, I'll start off sort of in line with the process of the college experience. So starting with the research piece of it and starting with, kind of where many of our junior families are right now. We've got a few questions that relate to the buyers and sellers.
Yep.
And how, we want to know now, we understand what buyers and sellers are, but how do we figure out who's who?
Yep.
And along those lines, I'll sort of build onto that question. You talk a lot about the different priorities that the colleges have. Is there a way for us to sort of figure that out and as we begin our research?
Two very good questions, and they're not easy to figure out. And remember, these are the buyers and sellers are a guide. I don't want anybody to say, well, you told me that school is a buyer and I didn't get any financial aid from them. So it's a guide. And I put a link in the chat, jeffselingo.com, buyers and sellers. You can find out a lot more there, including getting access to a list. But here's an easy way to do this. At the colleges that you're looking at, there's something called the Common Data Set. It's a great resource when you're applying to college. And most colleges, not all, publish it on their website. So look up Emory University and Common Data Set, and you could get their most recent one. Usually it's a year old or so, but it's good enough. And there is a treasure trove of data around admissions there and financial aid. It's what they submit to US News and World Report and Peterson's Guide and all the other guides out there. So it's basically every piece of information about the school, how many applied, who applied, test scores, things like that. And so one of the things in there is this financial aid group and this financial aid section. And there's a couple of things that you'll see in there. One is there is a line about institutional aid, and there are two columns. One column for non-need-based aid, merit aid, discounts, whatever you want to call it. And the second one is need-based aid. So the more need-based aid they give out and the less non-need-based aid they give out, the more likely they are a seller. You'll go down or up a couple of lines. I haven't looked at this in a couple of weeks, so I can't remember if it's up or down, but you'll see the average number of students who get non-need-based aid out of the freshman class. And if you go up further, you could see how many students are in the freshman class. So you can see, do they give out a lot of aid to a lot, or do they give out aid to a lot of students, non-need-based aid? You could figure that out. And then they'll give you the average non-need-based aid amount. So they might say it's $20,000 or $10,000. Again, it's only average, but it's those numbers that you could start to figure out. The more they give out in non-need-based aid, the more likely they are to be a buyer. And the more they give out in need-based aid, the more likely they are to be a seller. The other thing that really determines that is how selective they are. The more selective they are, in other words, the more students that they reject, and the higher yield they have, the more students that accept their acceptances, the more likely they are to be a seller. That means they're really in demand if they reject a lot of students and the students they do accept decide to come there. So those are the various numbers that go into my calculation. So the priorities thing is really easy because they don't tell you. They're not very transparent about this. Could you guess, or could you kind of get a sense? Sure. You could look at their strategic plan, which is often on their website, and that might give you a lot of keywords about things they're looking for or where they want to go. You could look at the press release that they put out last week, for example, on admissions, and say, okay, what kinds of students are they talking about? Are they talking about that SAT score? Are they talking about their geographic diversity, right? What are they talking about? Maybe they started a new health sciences school. Maybe that's a priority for them. Those are some of the things that you could figure out. This is not worth gaming out, though, to be honest with you, because there's just not enough information on there. And by the way, if you're applying to 10 schools, all those schools are going to have different priorities. My feeling is make your application about you the best you can make it, and then let the chips fall where they may. Because if you're going to try to game that system, it's really hard to.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick follow-up to one of the points that you just made? So you talked about selectivity as an indicator for buyers and sellers. Sometimes our students and families connect selectivity with quality. So aside from buyers, sellers, merit aid, is there anything else? What are the other things you can connect selectivity to? And can you speak about selectivity as an indicator of quality?
So selectivity is not an indicator of quality. It's an indicator of demand. It's an indicator that more people want to buy the Louis Vuitton purse than the knockoff purse somewhere else. But it doesn't mean that that is necessarily a better quality purse. And I think that's important to remember. Unfortunately, we don't have great quality metrics in higher ed. Now, if one of them is, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to stay in there, I'm going to graduate in 4 years. 2 metrics you should be looking at is the retention rate, so how many students they retain, and the graduation rate. Now, highly selective colleges have high retention rates and high graduation rates because they're taking really good students. Doesn't necessarily mean they're of high quality, but if you're trying to judge them against another school, look at retention and graduation rates, which you could get on their website. So that's one measure. Second measure is outcomes. Like, a lot of people want to know, am I going to get a job? Those numbers are a little squishy because they're self-reported. But the one thing the government does now, the federal government, on the college scorecard, which you could just Google, education department college scorecard, is you could look up the first year salaries for graduates in different programs at that college. And what you're going to find, it's only first year salaries at this point. Eventually, they're going to start building this out. But you could find out, for example, that a computer science major at Duke makes about the same as a computer science at the major at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, right? So you're going to start to see that there's a lot more overlap between these highly, highly selective schools and other schools. And then one final thing I want to leave you with, on this question, is because, I worked on the rankings and I spent a lot of time in the book on the rankings as well, is that there are very slight differences between, number 20 and number 50. Yes, is there a difference between 1 and 50? Sure. But students are tending to apply to schools within a range. And I think we tend to say, we put too much weight on, well, that's a top 20 school, as opposed to a top 50 school, as opposed to a top 75 school. Most students are not applying to number 1 and number 200. And I think that's important to remember, is that, it's within a range here.
Thank you. Moving a little bit into your experience, Jeff, being embedded with these 3 different admissions offices. We've got some great questions in the Q&A. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw and the various elements of an application, and sort of how, did you see certain essay topics being really, not so much the topic, does the topic matter? Were the admissions officers talking about, oh, this person, terrible topic, and so, we aren't going to, we don't like this application. Can you just address the various elements of the application?
Yeah, so, so in terms of importance, high school curriculum grades, test scores. When they are accepting test scores, they do look at test scores. They want to say, does it confirm something that we already believe about this student? Doesn't necessarily knock them out, but it's usually a confirmation of something. So those are the 3 things. Then they're looking at counselor and teacher recommendations. What are they saying about this student that the application doesn't tell us? A little bit more context, right? So, good recommendations help. They really do. It doesn't mean good recommendations in terms of like all positives. More details really help. How does this person interact in the classroom? How curious are they about things? So that's the probably like the second tier of stuff they're looking at. Along with that, they're looking at activities. They're not looking, by the way, that you've done. Well, there's 10 spots, I guess, on the Common App, right? Most students are filling out all 10 spots, but they're not looking at, did you dominate the world and do everything? They're looking for a couple of things. They're looking for examples of leadership, but it doesn't mean they're only looking at students who were a captain of a team or president of a club. They're looking for some commitment to something, right? So they don't want students who decided, oh, junior year, I'm applying to college next year, I better put some activities on my thing. And suddenly they just loaded their list with sign-up clubs, right? So they're looking for a balance of some students, they want to be leaders, but they know they can't pick every leader, because then when they get to college, you can't have all leaders, right? You have to have some followers. So they want students who are a mix of both. So they like both the leaders, and they like both the followers, and they like people who have committed to a couple of activities, and they also like those students who have committed to a bunch of activities as well. So they're looking, again, it's that context of the whole class. And then finally, I will be honest with you, the essays, they're mind-numbingly similar, because I think somebody read a book and said, oh, you should write about these 5 topics. Think about what you want to write about, right? don't try to guess what somebody on the other side of the desk who you've never met, you don't know what they want to read. It's what you want to write about. And so the best essays are the ones that are just authentic. An example of at Emory was when a student wrote about their family debates, how they're going to miss when they go to college, the family debates over pulp or no pulp orange juice. And it went into like this history of why there is no pulp orange juice. And just, it was just a really interesting essay that got at an authentic thing that actually was happening in somebody's life at a moment. Or another student who learned to bargain shop because they had to go out and shop for their mother one day because she was sick, and then started talking about how they started to compare products in a new and different way. Again, it's just something you could imagine an 18-year-old writing rather than trying to solve world peace in the Middle East or something like that. That's the thing, is that authentic piece of it.
Excellent. When you were in these admissions offices and whenever they're looking, we've got some questions from some of our athletes, from our student athletes. And, many students at Shady Side are interested in continuing and perhaps playing, maybe not at a Division I, maybe not at a UW, but maybe more at at an Emory or at a Davidson. How did the conversations differ whenever you were seeing files of recruited students?
So, there is an advantage to being an athlete, and I point this out in the book. There are, at most selective schools, the recruited athletes get in, they basically get in ED. So they reserve those spots. So most of those students are coming in because the coach has guided them along, and they get a pre-read, so they know what chances they have. They get a pre-read of their application, so they're told whether they have a chance of getting in or no chance. So they have that coming into the process, and they get in ED, so they know pretty early on whether they're in or not. And it matters. It's whether you like it or not. In fact, at Emory, I point this out, where a student got in early decision who was on the, I won't say what team because I didn't say in the book, but the coach really needed that position. And there's a quote in the book from the admissions officer: "I don't really love this kid, but the coach does." So they're in.
That chapter really blew my mind. Even though we live this all the time, I would, the piece about the number of athletes at Amherst and the number of athletes at Alabama, that was really mind blowing. So if you're among the parents with athletes or not, I think that chapter really helped put the athletic piece into the broader context to better understand, even if you're applying to a place like Amherst and you're not an athlete,
how hard it is to get in.
How hard it is, and why the slots feel so tight. And I thought that was just.
Lauren, it also puts in context to early decision, because this didn't come up tonight, but people think there's an advantage to applying early decision because they look at the acceptance rates, and the acceptance rates are usually a little bit higher for early decision. They're much closer, by the way, now than they were even 10 years ago. But one of the things you don't know is, did they accept most of their athletes early decision? So if you're not an athlete and you're applying early decision, that doesn't mean you have actually a better chance in early, because they've taken most of those spots with athletes.
Jeff, we have a few questions that sort of relate to COVID and the sort of the before times and looking ahead. And obviously we don't have a crystal ball here, and you talked a little bit about it already, but we've got some questions about what do you predict, what do you think will stick around as far as the changes that we've seen this year, both in the admissions and recruiting process, and even if you have any thoughts on from the college perspective, online classes, the calendar changes that many of our college colleagues have made. Can you just speak to that?
Yeah, so great question. I don't have a crystal ball. I will tell you, test optionals here to stay in a big way. I think some of these colleges will go back to requiring testing, but they're obviously not doing it. Most of them are not doing it next year. And I think many of them will not do it another year because they want to study the impact. So even the ACT has admitted that test optional is here to stay in a big way. So I think that's going to be a specter out there that's going to be different. I think online tours and online information sessions are here to stay. Doesn't mean they're going to stop the face-to-face tours. It doesn't mean they'll stop coming to your high schools. I think that travel is going to be reduced. So I think fewer college reps will be coming to high schools and going to college fairs, and there will be a lot more of this because they know they can reach a lot more students. But beyond that, I don't think a lot of the process piece is going to change. The deadlines and things like that, I don't think are going to change. As far as colleges go, I think some of the calendar changes are going to stick. They might reduce some breaks, might add some breaks. They might think of bringing different cohorts on campus at different times. Like I could imagine more programs, summer programs, to bring some students in early who want to start early. I could imagine more online courses, maybe in the summer before your freshman year to get a head start. I could imagine more hybrid courses, meaning you might be a residential student, but one of your courses might be fully online or partially online. And again, what does that do for you? Well, maybe I want to intern during the school year, and now I'm able to go to LA because I'm in Pittsburgh, and I could go to LA to intern for a couple of weeks and continue to take my classes online. So I think some of that stuff is going to stick.
Jeff, there's a question here that I love, and I think it sort of helps us to maybe let you wrap up a little bit. And I will say some wonderful questions have sort of been streaming into the Q&A, and I'll do a plug for, Lauren's going to bring this up too, but we are having a parent book club on April 27th, where we're going to discuss even more of the awesome things that you presented. And so if you had a question that we weren't able to answer today, bring that question back to you, to us with the book club. And I know Lauren and myself, Lucas, our whole team will be really happy to talk about it. And I'll put the chat for registration, or the registration link in the chat. But Jeff, if your own kids, you said you have a third grader and a fifth grader, if they were starting the college process tomorrow, which thank God they're not.
Thank God they're not.
Lauren and I also both have young kids, so we know. But what is one thing you would absolutely do with them, and one thing that you would absolutely not do as a parent?
So absolutely do. I think, going to college is about kind of questioning your ideals, questioning what you want to do. It's trying to open the world up to you. So, and you want to find mentors, right? People, long after people leave for college, anybody who went to college out there, what do you remember the most? You remember the people you met, the classmates you met, but also the faculty and the mentors you have, right? There are a couple of people that made a huge difference in my life 25 years ago in college that I still remember. I want to know how I find those, right? So when I go on college tours, what annoys me the most when I've gone on hundreds of college tours in my 20 plus years of covering higher education is that they take you all around and you follow them around like a herd of cats. And they take you into the library, and they take you into a dining hall, and they might take you into an academic building, into the lobby. And then they take you into a dorm room or whatever. And then that's it. And then they let you go, and you go into an information session, and that's supposed to be your campus tour. You rarely go into a classroom, and you rarely meet a faculty member. If I were with my kids, that's what I would do. Before I would go to the campus, and now you can even do this virtually, my son or daughter I have two daughters, my daughters want to major in chemistry. I would email the chair of the chemistry department, and I would say, could my daughter meet with one of the faculty members, especially one of the faculty members she might have as a first-year student? Could I sit in on one of your classes? When I'm on campus? What days do you have those classes? And by the way, when I'm on campus, I would walk into a building, into the academic building. I would go down the hallway of the department I'm thinking I'm majoring in, and I would look at the office hours, and I would see if the faculty members are actually there. Those are the things I would do. Now, somebody once told me, well, I can't, I went on a tour and they wouldn't let me in the academic building. That says a lot, by the way. Or the faculty member never got back to me if I emailed them. Says a lot. Right? I understand you're a prospective student. Hopefully they'll treat their current students better than their prospective students. It still says a lot. That's the thing I would do, is about the mentorship. And the final thing I would do on the tour is go to the Career Center and see what resources they have, not for after college, but during college. Like, do they help you get internships and things like that? Where did students majoring in what I want to major in, where did they intern? What would I not do? I would not jump first to a list of, I would not start my college search by saying, okay, here are the 15 colleges with names that I want to look at. And we're only going to, we're going to go tour those on spring break and summer and things like that. I would start the list a little bit more broadly by thinking about what kind of college do I want to go to? Do I want to go to I live down the street from the University of Maryland. I would take my daughter out there. My niece goes there, so we actually go out there a lot. And the first thing she said when she was out there, this place is huge. Now, she's only in 5th grade, so she probably would say that, but hopefully maybe as a freshman or sophomore, junior in high school, she would say, maybe she'd say the same thing, or maybe she'd say, wow, this is really cool. I go to a small high school. I want to be on a big campus where sports is really important and look in that great big football stadium. Or we might go to up to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and go to Dickinson and see what a small liberal arts college in a small town is like. We might go down to GW right here in my town, or AU, and see what an urban university is like, right? So those, I want to give them a sense of what types of colleges are like, and rural, urban, suburban, like where do you want to be? Then once we get a feel, and then maybe they like everything, but usually they don't, then we could start to put names to those types of institutions. Because I think we get too focused on the names too early. And I think that's where we end up with a lot of bad fits. So that's what I wouldn't do.
Gosh, thank you. This is being recorded, and the recording will be available for about 14 days, but I wish the recording was available forever, because I would just want to keep this playing in our office on a running spool, and have your words and your wisdom filtering in to future generations of Shady Side students. So a huge thank you to Jeff for being with us tonight. As Julie mentioned, we are doing a parent book club, and while Jeff won't be with us for the book club, you will get the whole college office. And we didn't get to very specific questions. Jeff is talking in generalities, and so if you're wondering, well, how does this translate down to Shady Side? What does this mean for our curriculum or for our lists or what our students do? We have that information, and we're happy to have this be really an ongoing conversation. We welcome it. We love it. We loved Jeff's book, obviously, and we just really love to talk about this. So, Trixie opened this up tonight by saying this was sort of a joint effort tonight with the Parents Association and Trixie and the senior school head, with enthusiastic support from our school president, who was a big fan of your book, Jeff. And the way these things come together is really that we work as a team. And Jeff, for tonight, it was just such an honor to have you be a part of this team. So,
well, I really appreciate it. And I want to end where you ended as well. I mean, I sit at a 50,000 foot view here around higher education and around admissions. The resources you have in your college counseling office, I think, are really important, and your counselors can ask. They know your situation 10 times better than I know. So my job in here tonight was not to contradict anything that they would say. Really, that's a great resource, and use them in the search.
Thanks.
So,
good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.